June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the English Channel. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stands alone in the pre-invasion darkness, holding a handwritten note in his pocket, a resignation letter already prepared. In 6 hours, 156,000 Allied troops will storm 5 beaches in Nazi-occupied France. Thousands will die in the first minutes. Eisenhower knows this. He authorized it. 18 months earlier, on the blood-soaked shores of North Africa and Italy, he learned the most brutal lesson of command. That victory isn't won through brilliance or technology. It's purchased with the lives of men you'll never meet. This is the story of how America's most reluctant warrior became its greatest general. In the autumn of 1942, as German panzers pressed deep into the Soviet Union and Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened the Suez Canal, the Allied High Command made a decision that bewildered many who heard it. They placed the fate of their first major offensive, Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, in the hands of a 52-year-old staff officer from Kansas who had never commanded men in combat. Dwight David Eisenhower was not supposed to be here. His entire military career had been built not on battlefields, but in classrooms and planning rooms. West Point had taught him theory. The Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth had honed his organizational mind. Washington had refined his gift for diplomacy. For 2 decades, he'd been the man behind the scenes, writing training manuals, coordinating logistics, serving as aide to generals who actually led troops. While contemporaries like Patton and Bradley earned their reputations commanding tanks and infantry divisions, Eisenhower shuffled papers in the War Department. Then came Pearl Harbor, and everything changed. In 18 months, he rocketed from obscurity to 3 stars. Chief of Staff George Marshall saw something others missed, a rare ability to balance egos, navigate politics, and think in grand strategic terms. The British needed an American to lead the alliance. Roosevelt needed someone who could work with Churchill without starting a diplomatic war. Eisenhower fit the mold perfectly, but fitting a political mold was different from commanding an invasion. British Field Marshal Alan Brooke made no secret of his doubts, writing in his diary that the Americans had chosen a good chairman, but questioning whether he possessed the steel required to direct battle. General Bernard Montgomery was even less diplomatic, viewing Eisenhower as Roosevelt's yes-man, a staff officer playing at war. They had led men through the hell of Dunkirk and the deserts of Egypt. What had Eisenhower led? Filing cabinets and planning committees. The weight of it pressed on him in those final weeks before Torch. Intelligence reports warned of Vichy French forces that might resist, of German reinforcements pouring into Tunisia, of beaches that could turn into killing grounds. Every decision he made would be measured in lives, young men who would never come home because he'd approved a landing zone or miscalculated enemy strength. He'd studied Clausewitz and Gemini, mastered the principles of war on paper, but theory didn't prepare you for signing orders that would fill hospital ships and cemetery plots. On November 8, 1942, 107,000 Allied troops would storm the beaches of Morocco and Algeria in the largest amphibious operation ever attempted. The entire operation rested on the judgment of a man who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Could a general who'd never been to war learn to win one? November 8, 1942, 0400 hours, the Atlantic swells black and cold. Across 300 miles of North African coastline, from Casablanca to Oran to Algiers, 107,000 Allied troops prepared to storm ashore in Operation Torch. They were coming to liberate. They expected cheering crowds and token resistance from demoralized Vichy French garrisons. Instead, they found war. At Oran, the pre-dawn darkness erupted in fire. French shore batteries, far from surrendering, opened up with devastating accuracy. The harbor assault, planned as a swift commando raid, became a bloodbath. 2 British destroyers, HMS Walney and HMS Heartland, pushed into the port carrying American Rangers. French guns tore them apart at point-blank range. Walney took over 40 direct hits before capsizing. Of the 393 men who entered Oran Harbor that morning, 189 died in the water or on burning decks. The survivors staggered ashore as prisoners. 300 miles west, off Casablanca, the battleship USS Massachusetts traded salvos with the French battleship Jean Bart in the largest naval engagement American forces would fight in the Atlantic theater. 16-inch shells screamed across the harbor as American troops waded through surf toward defended beaches. Naval gunfire, meant to suppress French positions, fell short. Civilians died in their homes as Casablanca burned. In Gibraltar's dank limestone tunnels, 600 feet beneath the rock, Eisenhower watched his carefully orchestrated plan disintegrate. Reports flooded his command post in fragments and contradictions. Paratroopers from the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment, dropped inland to seize airfields, were scattered across 200 miles of Moroccan desert. Some landed in Spanish Morocco. Others came down in salt marshes and mountains, miles from their objectives. The ground units meant to link up with them, bogged down in street fighting that dragged hour after bloody hour. Port Lyautey became a microcosm of the chaos. American infantrymen from the 60th Infantry Regiment exchanged fire with French Foreign Legionnaires in confused skirmishes where neither side knew who they were killing or why. Young men who trained together in North Carolina now bled out in North African dust, shot by allies defending a government that collaborated with Hitler. The destroyer USS Leadstown, packed with reinforcements, took a German U-boat torpedo on November 9th. She went down taking supply trucks, ammunition, and nearly 200 soldiers who drowned trapped below decks. By the third day, Eisenhower had his first casualty count. 526 Americans died, not from Wehrmacht veterans or SS divisions, from French colonial troops defending orders they barely understood. The theories he'd studied at Leavenworth, the elegant maneuvers, the calculated risks, the decisive strokes, meant nothing when faced with 19-year-old farm boys from Kansas drowning in transport ships or dying confused in Moroccan alleys. This wasn't the clean warfare of staff colleges and tables. This was butchery with a purpose. And he had ordered it. February 14, 1943, Valentine's Day. The Tunisian desert wind carried the sound of German tank engines across the western dorsal mountains. 3 months after Torch, Eisenhower's army was about to learn what real war looked like. At Kasserine Pass, a narrow gap in the Atlas Mountains, the American II Corps held defensive positions they believed were secure. Intelligence reports had tracked Rommel's Afrika Korps regrouping after defeats in Egypt, but no one expected what came next. At dawn, German armor struck with a violence that shattered every assumption American commanders held about their readiness. The assault opened with artillery, German 105 and 150 guns walking their fire across American positions with mathematical precision. Green troops from the 168th Infantry Regiment, who'd never experienced sustained bombardment, broke and ran. Entire companies dissolved into panicked flight. Then came the Panzers. German Mark III and Mark IV tanks, supported by the legendary 88 anti-tank guns, tore through American Sherman tanks as if they were made of paper. The Sherman's 75 gun couldn't penetrate German frontal armor at combat ranges. The German 88, originally designed as anti-aircraft artillery, could punch through a Sherman at 2,000 yards. American tank crews watched their rounds bounce off enemy armor, then died when return fire turned their vehicles into crematoriums. The 1st Armored Division, America's premier tank force, lost 50 tanks in the first 2 days, not to superior tactics or overwhelming numbers, to superior equipment and combat experience they simply didn't possess. Crews abandoned vehicles that still ran, fleeing on foot across the desert. By February 19th, the catastrophe was complete. 6,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing. 4,000 more captured and marched into German POW camps. 50 miles of desert littered with abandoned equipment, tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, supply dumps. Entire battalions had ceased to exist as fighting units. Eisenhower drove to the front and saw it in his soldiers' faces. Not just exhaustion, but something worse. Shame. The bitter knowledge that they'd run while the enemy stood and fought. These were the same troops he'd watched train stateside, the men he'd promised would be ready. They weren't, and that failure was his. Back in London and Washington, the cables flew. Churchill questioned American combat capability. Reporters asked whether industrial production meant anything if the troops couldn't fight. Some wondered openly if Americans had the stomach for this war at all. Eisenhower's response was surgical and merciless. He relieved the II Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose leadership during the battle had been paralyzed by indecision. He brought in George Patton, gave him 3 weeks to rebuild a broken corps, and rewrote tactical doctrine based on hard lessons paid for in blood. But privately, in the stone-walled headquarters at Constantine, the question haunted him. Kasserine had cost 6,000 casualties to teach lessons that should have been learned in training. How many more would die while his army grew up? He had 2 choices: pull back, consolidate, and rebuild slowly, or push forward, accepting that more men would fall before they learned to win. He chose the offensive, because stopping meant Kasserine wasn't a lesson, it was just waste. July 9, 1943, 2300 hours. The Mediterranean night swallowed 3,000 American paratroopers as they jumped into darkness over Sicily. Operation Husky was Eisenhower's second invasion. This time, there would be no miscalculations. North Africa had taught brutal lessons. Sicily would prove whether he'd learned them. The invasion plan reflected a commander transformed by failure, precision timing, overwhelming force, and the cold acceptance that some men would die so that others might live. The airborne assault opened the campaign. 3,400 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division dropped across southeastern Sicily to seize bridges and road junctions before dawn. High winds and inexperienced pilots scattered them across 60 miles of hostile territory. Gliders carrying British troops and anti-tank guns crashed into the Mediterranean, drowning men before they could fire a shot. Dozens of sticks landed miles from their objectives. But the chaos worked. German commanders, receiving reports of parachutists across the entire island, held back armored reserves they should have thrown at the beaches. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division stayed dispersed, hunting scattered paratroopers while the real threat came from the sea. At 02:45 on July 10th, 160,000 Allied troops hit 7 beaches across 100 miles of Sicilian coastline. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, stormed ashore at Gela against dug-in Italian defenders. These weren't the green troops who'd panicked at Kasserine. These were combat veterans who knew how to fight through machine gun fire and artillery. They carved out beachheads and held them against German counterattacks that would have broken them 5 months earlier. The campaign ground forward for 38 days. American forces, now under Patton's aggressive command, drove across mountains and through fortified towns against determined resistance from German regulars. Eisenhower had learned the arithmetic of war. He ordered the bombing of Messina, knowing Sicilian civilians sheltered in those buildings, because destroying the port would trap German divisions trying to evacuate to mainland Italy. He approved operations with full knowledge of their human cost: 500 dead to take this ridge, 1,200 casualties to seize that harbor, and he made those decisions without the paralysis that had marked his early command. Then came July 11th. The second wave of paratroopers, 144 C-47 transports carrying reinforcements to secured beachheads, flew into friendly airspace. Naval gunners, jumpy after German air attacks, opened fire. 23 aircraft went down in flames. 318 American paratroopers died, shot from the sky by their own forces. Eisenhower's fury was immediate and absolute. He demanded court-martial. He ordered a complete overhaul of air-naval coordination procedures, but he did not halt operations. The mission continued because Sicily had to fall, and the price of stopping was higher than the price of the mistake. By August 17th, Sicily belonged to the Allies. German forces had escaped across the Strait of Messina, 40,000 troops who would fight again in Italy, but the strategic victory was undeniable. American forces had fought and won against German regulars on European soil. The schoolteacher general was gone. In his place stood a commander who understood that victory required not brilliance, but the willingness to accept terrible costs and keep moving forward. January 22, 1944, 0200 hours, the Tyrrhenian Sea lay calm and dark. 36,000 Allied troops stormed ashore at Anzio, 30 miles south of Rome, in an amphibious operation designed to break the Italian stalemate. The landings caught the Germans completely off guard. By noon, the beachhead was secure. Resistance was light. The road to Rome lay open. Then nothing happened. Major General John Lucas, commanding VI Corps, looked at his empty beaches and made a decision that would haunt the campaign. Instead of pushing inland toward the Alban Hills, the high ground that dominated all approaches to Rome, he consolidated. He dug in. He waited for reinforcements while German Field Marshal Albert Kasserine, one of the war's most capable defensive commanders, rushed troops from across Italy to seal the trap. Within 72 hours, 8 German divisions surrounded the Anzio beachhead. What was supposed to be a lightning strike became a siege. For 4 months, Allied forces clung to a perimeter 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide, smaller than Manhattan, under constant German artillery fire. Every square yard of the beachhead was within range of German guns positioned in the Alban Hills that should have been taken in the first 48 hours. Hospitals, supply dumps, and command posts took daily bombardment. Soldiers called it Hell's half-acre and the biscuit box. 7,000 casualties in the first week. The numbers kept climbing. In London, preparing for Overlord, Eisenhower watched his last major operation before D-Day turn into exactly what he'd learned to recognize: tactical success that meant nothing without strategic exploitation. The landing worked. The generalship didn't. His response was clinical. He didn't question the casualties. He questioned what they'd purchased. Lucas had hesitated when boldness was required, chosen safety when risk offered victory. On February 22nd, Eisenhower approved his relief, replacing him with Lucien Truscott, a commander who understood that ground gained mattered more than men preserved. But the damage was done. Anzio bled for 4 more months. When the beachhead finally linked up with forces breaking through the Gustav Line in May, the butcher's bill came due: 43,000 Allied casualties for a beachhead that never achieved its strategic purpose of unhinging German defenses. Eisenhower wrote to Marshall with cold arithmetic. He analyzed Anzio's losses as acceptable given strategic alternatives: the casualties that would have resulted from frontal assaults on German mountain positions further south. This wasn't the staff officer from 1942 agonizing over every name on casualty lists. This was a commander who'd learned that victory required terrible mathematics. Thousands dead at Anzio versus tens of thousands dead elsewhere. Neither option good, one option necessary. Italy had taught him the final lesson. Detailed planning mattered. Overwhelming force mattered. But what mattered most was the will to accept losses and exploit them toward victory, to relieve commanders who hesitated, and to keep pushing regardless of the blood price. 3 months later, he would need every one of those lessons. Because on the beaches of Normandy, the cost would be measured not in thousands, but in the certainty that men would die in the first minutes by the hundreds, and the invasion would continue anyway. The question wasn't whether to accept casualties anymore. The question was whether they would be spent on something worth their sacrifice. June 5, 1944, 2000 hours. A light rain fell across southern England. Eisenhower walked among the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division at Greenham Common Airfield, men who would jump into Normandy in less than 4 hours. He joked with them, asked about hometowns, inspected equipment with the easy confidence of a commander who believed in his plan. They didn't know he just reviewed casualty projections, estimating that 1 in 4 of them wouldn't survive the next 24 hours. Lieutenant Wallace Strobel from Michigan, Private Robert Wright from Texas, Sergeant John Rayburn from Ohio. He shook their hands, looked them in the eyes, projected absolute certainty that they would win. Then he returned to his headquarters at Southwick House and wrote a letter accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. The words were simple, drafted in pencil on a small notepad. If the landings collapsed, if German panzers drove his forces back into the sea, the blame would be his alone. He dated it July 5th by mistake, a small human error on the night he ordered the largest amphibious invasion in history. At 0630 on June 6th, 156,000 Allied troops hit 5 Normandy beaches across 50 miles of French coastline. German machine guns opened fire from concrete bunkers. Artillery walked across landing craft before they reached shore. Omaha Beach became a killing ground where the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions took 2,000 casualties in the first hours, men drowning in surf or cut down crossing open sand. By nightfall, the beachheads held, but 4,414 Allied soldiers were dead. The battle for Normandy continued for 76 days. American, British, and Canadian forces ground through hedgerow country against German defenders who made them pay for every field and every village. When Paris fell on August 25th, the butcher's bill came due: 425,000 Allied casualties, including 72,000 dead, to break out of Normandy and liberate France. Eisenhower had approved every operation knowing these numbers would come. He was no longer the staff officer who'd recoiled at casualty reports from Operation Torch. He'd learned the brutal calculus that accepting losses in Normandy would end the war faster than cautious alternatives that would kill more men over longer timelines. The paradox of command. His willingness to spend lives saved them overall. After the war, he visited the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach. 9,000 white marble crosses stretched in perfect rows across 42 acres of French soil. He walked among them in silence, reading names of men who died because he'd given the order to go. Private First Class Raymond Hobeck, Staff Sergeant William Garfield, Captain Robert Walker. Every marker represented a decision he'd made, a calculation that their deaths would purchase something worth the cost. He would later write that he hated war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity. But in 1944, he'd learned what command required, not brilliance or courage or tactical genius, but the ability to accept you will send men to die and to live with that choice afterward. The schoolteacher from Kansas had learned to win wars the hard way, by understanding there is no good way to fight them, only necessary ways, and by carrying the weight of every name on every white cross for the rest of his life.